Hey folks, in this interview, I'm going to be sitting down with Ian Shive. We're going to be talking about climate change and conservation efforts, amongst other things, and maybe we'll throw some photography in there. This is TWiP. Hey, welcome back to This Week in Photo. I'm your host, Frederick Van Johnson. Today I'm talking with Ian Shive. Like I said in that intro there, he's involved with lots of stuff that hopefully are related with making our planet a better place. Or at least preserving it a little bit for future generations. He's a photographer, and he does a whole bunch of other things. I'm going to let him tell you what he's working on in the interview. We call it the origin story. So Ian Shive, welcome to This Week in Photo, man. How you doing?
Very good. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. You look like you are in, normally when I interview people, they are in sort of a stuffy office with a webcam and all that. You are in it. You're someplace that...
I'm in it.
Is this your home there?
It is, yeah. It's a respite from the city. I live in Los Angeles, and I have an area that is surrounded by trees, though you might pick up a little bit of the deforestation that's happening right now around me as people seem to be clearing some of the growth. We've had an incredible rain year here. Probably one of the best in recent memories, to be honest with you. And so everything is so lush and green, and it's a pretty good time to be outside doing an interview.
I love it.
Our office is sort of outdoors as well, so there's no happy medium for doing these things.
No, this is good. You got great lighting, so it's perfect. No, it's Los Angelinos cannot complain when it rains, right?
We cannot.
You don't complain about a drop of rain because it could be taken away. Just like that, it's gone. So
it's true. It's true.
Well, cool, man. Well, let's dive in. So let's talk a little bit about your history and what got you started in the world of photography and why you're still here.
Well, it's funny you use the words origin story because my origin story actually kind of does begin with the spider. And all jokes aside. I worked at Sony Pictures Entertainment. That's how I ended up in Los Angeles. I worked there for 10 years, and one of the first major projects I worked on was in marketing, and it was the original Spider-Man movie. And so I spent 10 years there, and that whole time I was at the studio, this passion for being outdoors, for getting out of the city, just kept growing within me, within that experience. And so every time I'd get to a Friday, the best way to unwind, the best way to just let go of the stress of working in a movie industry was to go to a national park or to go outdoors and go camping or go hiking and just completely clear the cobwebs if you want to have fun with it. And it began there, essentially, for me as a photographer. But, the irony is I actually grew up as the son of a photographer. I have two very creative parents. My mother's a writer. My dad started as a classic rock and roll photographer. So I was always around it, but I also realized that it was an extremely difficult business, that photography, especially when you're thinking about it 30, 40 years ago, was always facing a lot of different challenges. And in those days, some of the challenges that my dad endured, especially with like stock photography, for instance, were, the evolution of the CD and how you could get 30 or 40 images on one CD at a time and how it was going to change the whole business and maybe even ruin it. And, you kind of grew up hearing that. And so you say, well, where can I put my creative passions elsewhere, because I don't think I want to take on that challenge. I've seen it way up close and personal, and he ended up having a lot of success over the years, but that early influence really sort of altered my path and ultimately sent me from New Jersey, where I grew up, out here to Los Angeles, where I moved for a job at the studio. But that's sort of the very beginning roots of it. And then from there, essentially what happened was I stayed at the studio for 10 years, almost 10 years. It was about 9.5 years. I worked on all 3 Spider-Man movies and a bunch of other really cool movies, the Adam Sandler movies, Will Smith movies. And, it was a very informative time for me because I had an opportunity to see how films are created in a very intimate way. I'd spend time on sets. I'd sit inside of a scoring session with some of the best musicians and film composers of our time. I'd watch a screening with Ridley Scott sitting in the theater. I'd see how editors worked. And so I had this very intimate view of the motion side of the business. And so I essentially had this foundation that was stills, my childhood, and now motion, my first career. And so as this desire to be outdoors continued to build, and my lack of passion for where I was at the studio, I loved the job actually very much. It was a dream job. I loved the people. it wasn't like 100%. It was 95% of what I wanted to be doing. And so I decided after almost a decade and at the end of the third Spider-Man film to actually go out on my own as a nature photographer. And that was probably one of the most mortifying experiences of your life, if you think about it, because you're going from a pretty good job, well-paying, good benefits, very comfortable, to now what? Now I'm freelance. Where does every paycheck come from? Every couple of weeks. And so it was an interesting path.
But what sparked that jump, though? Because a lot of people listening to this will say, yeah, you were in it. You were living the dream where you're working on movies, you're rubbing elbows with legends and creating, things that millions of people enjoy, and then you flip the coin and move to nature. Not to say that that's less important, but what was that sort of point of inflection that pushed you over the edge to do that?
There were two things that really pushed me over the edge to do that. And I think the first thing was that I actually had started submitting images to a stock agency. And so it's submitting work and creative work to a place that could sell my images while I had a full-time job. So I'd go out and shoot in my free time, essentially, submit images to a stock agency, and then see them get sold. And that's what happened for me. In fact, I think my first two sales were to National Geographic and Time magazine at the time. And this light bulb went off, and I'm like, oh, I got a check for, X amount of dollars from just two images. I didn't really realize this was truly viable. I was doing it to get published, but then I also started to see that there was a revenue opportunity associated with it. And so that was I'd say the beginning of the idea, the seed that was planted. And so I continued to build up my library and build up my archive over several years. And it got to a point where the demand for my images in the marketplace and the sense of what I felt like was happening was great enough that I had to then sort of assess the two opportunities. I think the other big thing that also led me to make that final leap was that I appreciated being up close to the film industry, but I saw a lot of potential for storytelling that wasn't taking place. And so what happened around the time that I left was that the DSLR suddenly had great motion capabilities. And that's where I went on to create my company, Tandem Stills and Motion. It was the idea that those two things work together in tandem. And that's where the idea was born. And so, again, my whole life has always really been about how those two things pair together. And so seeing that there were opportunities to tell stories, and I had hoped to. I didn't think I'd ever. I didn't aspire to make my own Spider-Man film necessarily, but I definitely aspired to tell stories on a three-dimensional level with motion, as well as using photography as a major component of that storytelling element as well. And so it really was just driven out of that desire to explore a creative side deeper. Yeah. And not just be limited by that profession at that moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm so refreshed that you say that, because companies like Adobe, for example, they're putting out the Creative Cloud and all these amazing tools for people to build things with, and then on top of that, on the consumption side of the equation, everyone has a smartphone with a beautiful screen on it. Everyone, presumably probably has a computer or a tablet or something. There's screens everywhere that will show things other than just a still photo, right? So,
right.
And we talk about on the show a lot, why aren't people telling stories using, I hate to use the dated term multimedia, but mini media, right? Yeah. So and why do you think that is? Why are photographers, for example, still, sort of pigeonholing themselves into, the still shot
photography.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, it's an art form that can never be mastered, right? But still, why not use all the tools and tell stories with audio, video, motion, etc.? What do you think?
For that exact reason you just pointed out, audio, motion, etc. I think the bar of entry is really challenging. It's just like still photography. There was always a creative race, creating great work that was as good, or at least, maybe even better, but certainly at least as good as your peers and your competition. And you face the same challenges in motion, except I think the costs can be intimidating. And I think that the process and workflow can be really intimidating for people. I don't think it has to be. And I think similar to the path of photography, where it went from being something that only pros could do to something that many different people can do through the access of their phones and different technologies that streamline the technical processes. I think video is also kind of doing that, but it's a much longer tail on it. And I think that inevitably you have a lot of different skill sets that really apply in the video world. I'm not an editor. Mm-hmm. And having a video editor that I can work with, who's talented, who knows how to tell a story in a unique way, and knows how to work with the footage and provide feedback. Same with the musician, who can see each character as its own song and its own instrument, and tell that, allows for three-dimensional storytelling. And I think that bar of entry makes it a little more definitely a lot more challenging, I think, for most folks to get into it. But you don't necessarily have to do that. You don't have to go out and create a big film or a big screen film. And I think that the tools are getting much easier for people to be creative using multimedia.
Yeah. Well, should in your opinion, should photographers be moving in that direction? The direction. Let me reframe the question. So right now we see a lot of, even on This Week in Photo in our community, TWiP.pro, we see a lot of people that are great photographers, but they're encapsulating a story in one frame, which the beginning of photography and art in general. Painting a photo was one frame. Do you think, in your opinion, considering your experience in Hollywood and now, with the stuff that you're working on now, should photographers be moving away from that and away from the single frame, i.e. tandem stills in motion?
Not all of them. I don't think all of them should be. I think that you have to define the way you want to tell a story. I think some people's ability to tell a story in a single frame is absolutely exceptional, and it's a completely different skill than telling stories through multiple shots in a series of moving images or mixed media. And so I think it really comes down to the individual. That said, I think there is a tremendous opportunity for creatives, for photographers in particular, to realize new revenue through the stock industry or through even just producing. I mean, you don't have to produce. You could, similar to shooting a still image, you could do the same thing for stock, with Tandem or Adobe. And that's how I think people can maybe open up more revenue opportunities. Because at the end of the day, we can sit here and talk about the creativity and the passion and all of that, but you've got to be able to afford it too. And you have to be able to afford your life and all of those things. And so I think that you have to think of it as a business. And I think that motion absolutely plays a critical role in the future of many photographers' businesses. But I don't know that all photographers are necessarily equipped for it or ready for it.
Yeah.
But it's a business. It's just like you wouldn't open a restaurant or some retail business without the proper preparation, without the proper investment, the proper education, and the proper support for it. And so I think that you really have to bring all of those pieces to the table when you're thinking about whether you really want to do motion or not.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love it. Great answer. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about, we'll still talk about motion, but let's talk about Hidden Pacific. It's a project that took you to some exciting, relatively unknown places on the planet. Tell me about how that project came to be.
Yeah, very, very unknown. So after I left the studio, essentially, I became very immersed in the public land system. And so national parks, the Yosemites, Mount McKinley, Denali National Park. It was McKinley when I climbed it many years ago. Denali National Park. I was on a lot of assignments. I was on assignments for the National Park Conservation Association, especially. And so I kind of got this notoriety as being a public lands person. And really bringing attention to lesser known stories of places that people were very familiar with. Most people know Old Faithful in Yellowstone or something like that. But they didn't realize that there might be this great backcountry lake or this other experience that national park rangers, live every day. That's still part of our public land system. And so that was my foundation. And I did that for 4 years solo. And then I continued to do it for a number of years after I started Tandem. I started Tandem about 9 years ago in June. And so that was my foundation. That foundation led to the interest of the National Wildlife Refuge System, which is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the National Wildlife Refuge System said, well, similar to how people don't necessarily know parts of national parks, they really don't know a lot about us at all. Mm-hmm. And the National Wildlife Refuge System is the largest public land and water system in the world.
What?
And
okay.
yeah, and most people don't realize it. And so
no
they
idea.
said, Could you work with us? Could we work with you to tell our story and to bring these places to people? And Frederick, just like you said in the beginning of this call, like the devices and how we're experiencing things and video, emotion, and stills, and we're getting all this information. For me, and I think the evolution of my career since I left the studio, it's been almost 13, 14 years now since I left the studio. The evolution of my career has been looking at devices as a way for people to experience something for the first time. It's like a form of visitorship. To be able to visit a place that you may never get to see or never get to go to, or maybe that you aspire to go to or want to learn about. And so it's a very powerful tool, photography and video, for connecting with people around the world. From their armchair, they can visit these places. And so National Wildlife Refuge, just when I started, very, very, very gradually, like most relationships, it started locally here in California with a few still images, and it kept building and building and building until one day, the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Midway, Midway Atoll, which is halfway between the United States and Asia, came up. And the project lead, this woman Alice, calls me, and she's been a phenomenal supporter of our work and relationship as we figure out how do you tell a story of an island in the middle of nowhere, essentially. And we got to go out there and tell that story, to tell the story of the battle. And to tell the story of the evolution of the island becoming this flagship of oceanic conservation. And it's part of this really tremendous area that was created by George W. Bush and then later expanded by President Obama. It's a marine national monument. And so, like national parks, people don't realize there are, and national monuments, people might be familiar with like Bears Ears or Escalante. There are these things called marine national monuments, and Papahanaumokuakea, which is a really big mouthful. It took me about an hour to learn how to say properly. But Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, for a brief moment in time, was the largest protected area on the planet, and is still one of the largest protected public land and water areas. And so no one had really, a few people had been there, but nobody had really had the time to develop a story there. And so we started developing the story of this island. I brought an underwater cinematographer. We shot stills. We were able to capture a land, air, sea approach to Midway. And upon returning from there, we realized the success through partnerships and people wanting to see the island. And we actually created a film about it called Midway. Wow. And from there, they said, well, what about the rest of the islands in the Pacific? And essentially, that's where a dream job really just became something whole next level. I mean, it was the experience of a lifetime. So I essentially was able to go to 3 other very remote coral atolls that are considered the most pristine places in the Pacific Ocean, as pristine as they can certainly be, because there's certainly plenty of challenges facing all of these places. Yeah. But they're the most baseline, and so they have the healthiest shark populations, manta rays that are 18 feet wide that swim by you in the water, schools of birds that are so dense they blacken out the sky. I'm hearing the Jurassic Park music playing in the background as you're saying this. Yes, and that's what we went for when we actually produced the movie. But it was just magical, and to see what, in a way, it was like going back in time and seeing what the Pacific, what Hawaii actually was like long before tourism and all the other issues that can face marine life and so on like that, or before just in general, all people on the planet. This is sort of a glimpse into that. And no one on some of the islands, like Rose Atoll, was one of the places I went to, 185 miles east of American Samoa. It sounds glorious, some rough oceans and some rough trips in the process. Yeah. But walking around, barefoot on an island that's uninhabited with maybe 5 or 6 other people, filming, we brought both stills and motion cameras, and so we're filming, IMAX quality for our movie Hidden Pacific, and to be able to do that and to be the first person to film them, the first person to jump into the water and see what's there. I mean, we didn't have, we had dive plans, but when you jump in, it's not like it was an established tourist destination. You're learning as you go. And so it essentially was this culmination. Hidden Pacific has been the culmination of a lot of different relationships. And so the original reason actually that we were brought out was to create a suite of creative deliverables for the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we created a library of photos. We created a little film for them as well, several films for them as well that could be used in outreach and education and visitorship. And in the process, essentially, we realized we'd captured so much that we could make a movie out of it. So that's what we pursued over the last couple of years.
You must have felt a little bit like Charles Darwin setting foot on the Galapagos, right? It just sort of like, okay, this is, I'm boldly going, Yeah. So
you do. I mean, the birds walk up to you. Things don't really know what to do when they see you. You walk into the water up to your ankles, and a small baby shark will come up and check you out and then swim off. And you might see 2 or 3 sharks like that, in an afternoon. And I mean, it is like that. And there's very few places left that are like that. So it's very important that they're protected.
What was the journey like getting out there, though? Like, was it, you mentioned rough seas and all that? Was it,
yeah.
I mean, there's a reason why no one's there, right? So,
yeah. Well, one of the islands is physically unable to support people because it's only 16 acres around. So it's a quick, 10, 15 minute walk all the way around. And the highest point on it is only 5 or 6 feet, and that's Rose Atoll. So it can even become inundated. It's an area where cyclones are born. It's 185 miles on a slow ship out of American Samoa. It was pretty rough. There was one trip, we made it out there twice. And one of them was extremely memorable in the sense that it was everyone had to lay flat because the boat was so rough. Our gear, everything would just be flying up into the air a lot of the time.
Wow.
It wasn't easy, but you're dealing with the elements. You're constantly covered from the sun because you're just out there for 14 hours a day filming. Making sure you're properly hydrated, bringing the right amount of food, making sure you have places to charge your batteries. Where do you download your content? How do you review it? How do you look for problems? How do you deal with humidity? It was just an endless list of challenges.
I love it.
Because it was nuts. But again, it was the trip of a lifetime, though, too. I mean, it was a dream. And when you see the film and you see the photos, so all the photos, for instance, are on Adobe and Tandem Adobe Stock. They're like, it's a candy, like the colors of them are the blues and the reds and the pinks. And you're like, is this place real? Like, does this really look like this? And it's like, yeah, when it's really that clean and it looks that good. That was the planet
before we started messing around with it. And, and dragging it, humans came and dragged the clarity slider to the left a little bit, and we continue to do that.
The dehaze slider is what we need right now.
Yeah, I know. We're going the opposite direction on the dehaze slider. So I want to talk a little bit about. And by the way, while you were mentioning your trip out to that island, before I heard Jurassic Park music. That time I heard Gilligan's Island music. You could have easily been trapped out there, right?
Yeah. The thought goes through your mind, I assure you.
Right, like, can I survive here? So I want to just chat a little bit about the importance of focusing your efforts on projects. Sure. as you describe this project, obviously your passion for it is clear, right? And you're excited about it, and it makes your excitement is infectious. It makes me want to go see the images and see what the heck you're talking about, right? Which I'll link to in the post for this video, of course. But speaking to the This Week in Photo audience, the audience, or photographers, advanced amateurs, even some semi-pros and pros, tend to get stuck in this eddy of gear and upgrading, and I got to get this new lens, I got to get this new camera, mirrorless versus DSLR, JPEG versus RAW, Adobe versus this, there's all these verses going on.
Right.
But no one's taking, doing what you're doing, or most people aren't doing what you're doing in terms of, okay, I'm going to find something that I'm passionate about and, just go 110% into that. Can you give some tips on how to do that, how to break out of that eddy and start doing things that are important, whether they're political, socioeconomical or environmental, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, what can I do? Well, I always like the old joke of what's the difference between a professional photographer and an amateur photographer, and it's that the amateur has better equipment than the professional.
And it's clean.
And it's clean. Yeah, exactly. I mean, our gear's pretty haggard, but we make it go a long way, and you have to. because you do need a budget, and you have to think about where else can that go, and travel costs and things like that. Another analogy I like to give is, the kid who's 12 years old using, whatever camera came in the top of his laptop, who also has like 35 million views on his video. He's not shooting on the greatest and latest equipment with the greatest lenses, worried about whether it's RAW or JPEG or whatever it is. Like, a great story, a great moment, whether that's in a still image or a video, it resonates. It's an emotional resonance that transcends, the quality. And, if you want to shoot professionally, you have to have certain minimums. You have to pay attention to certain things, and you want to be competitive. But I think identifying a passion, no matter how far flung it is, you don't have to go out into the middle of nowhere like I do. Identifying a passion or something that you care about is what's going to make it work.
Yeah.
And it's what's going to really connect with people. And so I think in order to break the eddy, I think, stop going into the camera stores or whatever. I'm probably gonna get a lot of camera shops that are like, no, don't say that. But stop spending so much time in there, and instead spend more time, researching subject matter that you care about, and spending time doing it, living it, and experiencing it. And that's the best advice I could tell people is go out and have experiences, and use your camera as a way to capture and tell those experiences and share them with people, because that's really what photography and filmmaking is about. It's not about just the technical thing, but it's about sharing things with people. And that's why social media has worked so well, because it's the best way for us to see the world through another person's eyes. And, that's ultimately what it's about. So, again, local things. There's so many things that you can do locally. Whether, if you're in a city, there's national wildlife refuges close to every major city in America, more or less. You can try and identify stories there and build upon it, but really you have to begin somewhere. And I started small. I mean, most people do start small. You start with that little seed and then let it grow from there.
Yeah. And that's sage advice, right? And the other part of that I would love to have you comment on is, a lot of people get stuck in the eddy of thumbs up and likes.
Yes,
right? And
absolutely.
They're shooting for the like, and I'll even draw a little tighter circle around it. Is when people, let's say on Instagram, they're shooting for Instagram, and they'll judge the quality of or the success of an image by the number of likes they have on it.
Yeah.
And, I look at it as like a koi pond, right? So they're like, hey, the fish seem to like this kind of bread. Let me get more of that kind of bread and throw it in there, versus like doing what you're doing and telling stories and, shooting for the subject matter versus shooting for the adoration and the recognition. How do you break out of that?
Great point.
Yeah.
That's a great question and a great point. I think, it's a habit, right? So breaking out of it can be really challenging, but
it's an addiction, I think, in some ways.
There's exactly. I think that, one thing I'll say to people too, as a piece of advice, is what is popular on social media isn't necessarily what sells. And so we've definitely seen a huge disparity in our sales, with Tandem and Adobe versus what people may like a lot. And part of the reason is because social media tends to follow trends, and it's being replicated by lots of people. They say, oh, well, this guy's getting a lot of likes, or she's posting this photo, let me do the same thing. And so it gets very quickly saturated. And then what happens is, because you're liking it and you're following it and you're hitting all these certain hashtags, you get a very narrow focus and very pigeonholed view of the world because of the algorithms of social media, which are just feeding you more of the same. You're not necessarily breaking out into new things that you may like, that you may not even realize you like, because they're not being presented to you. Mm-hmm. And so I think I've got a really good helicopter about to go overhead in a second. Sorry, I love it.
This is real life. This is
real. Yeah.
Live
Welcome
TV
to Los
here.
Angeles. Yeah, it's welcome to Los Angeles. So, but that's one thing I think to just be aware of. But then, I think the other thing to think about is, like, those trends tend to be very, very broadly focused. Small person, big landscape, a headlamp looking up at the stars, those kinds of things. And sure, they may sell and whatever, they may do well for people, and you may get a lot of likes. But the thing we found, and this is where I think Tandem and Adobe have really, really have grown very strong in our relationship, and by focusing on the finer details of an image. It's not just a person on a trail, but which trail is it? And are you getting into a different part of the place? So the depth of your knowledge of the subject matter, I think, can separate you from social media, because some things certainly have depth and they have the potential to, but it also has the potential to work against you as well. And so really thinking about, how can I go deeper into my subject matter? And so for us in the outdoors, in our library, in our archive, we're always looking at, is the person really a surfer? Authenticity, I think, is extremely important, and something that can be very quick to be missed in social media as well. And so, are they really a surfer? Do they really trail run?
Yeah.
And you can tell, the difference between a person who's really passionate about something versus a person who's just doing it to create an image or to create likes are two different worlds. And that's the difference between a really great library, a really great stock library that you can see revenue and you can see potential from, versus somebody who's just trying to get more thumbs ups.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's reality or like reality, right?
Yes, yes. True.
Yeah, you can have that. You can take that. So I want to start wrapping this up. I want to talk a little bit about the if you could describe the relationship that you guys, your company, has with Adobe, and how that came to fruition, and what it's all about. How are you guys working together?
Yeah. Well, like all photographers, my first impression of Adobe was Photoshop. What really excited me was the folks who contacted me from Adobe Stock were people that I had worked with early on in my career. They were photo editors. And, I liked that because I knew that they had come from the industry, from storytelling, from a technical background, and that they were looking for, real good content, something that was different from what was out there. And, stock has sort of become a dirty word for a lot of people. They're like, oh, we don't use stock. We work with individual photographers. And it's like, well, what do you think stock is? It's a bunch of individual photographers working together. And so 9 years ago, I formed Tandem to help unify other like-minded individuals like myself, other photographers, friends who were passionate about the outdoors, and bring us together and create a very in-depth library of outdoor images. After that time, after a period of time, only in the last year or so, we connected with Adobe Stock and started talking about how can we reach our audience on a broader level, on a global level. And so Tandem has done a great job of being highly specialized, of getting that depth, of building a library of images that are inclusive and diverse and really represent the nature and outdoor world in the best way possible. But we were having some challenges as a small company. We're only about 9 or 10 people or so. As a small company, reaching a global audience. And so in talking to Adobe, I realized that we had very similar synergies, and that we were looking to not, first, here we are talking, right? I mean, that's a big difference between how most partnerships and distribution deals and sales deals work in the stock world. They're usually just like, well, let's just have the images and see you later. We'll send you a check every now and then, kind of thing. In this case, it was a relationship, and it was about talking about and exploring what works in the library, what doesn't. How can we identify trends? How can we work together? And I really think that we have an opportunity to learn from each other, because we can provide our specialty, our specializing in the outdoors, to their base, and in exchange they can provide data and a global audience that we otherwise can't reach on our own either. And so it just really made sense for us to work together for that in that way, and it's been great.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, it's I love what Adobe's doing in the stock world, and it's interesting because I did an interview a while back with someone from the Adobe Stock team, and the research that those guys do in terms of identifying trends and what's popular and the zeitgeist geographically is just it's very niche down, and they make it public, so that's really, really cool.
I know. Yeah, it was tricky. It was a big decision for us. At first we were really hesitant to distribute our work. We wanted to stay that specialized agency, but you're sort of limiting your photographers' opportunities as well. And as we tell stories like the stuff that you and I have been talking about today of these islands and these places, the purpose is to share them with a broader audience. And so I think it's easy to get caught up in likes and things. I think it's also easy to get caught up in just like dollars and saying, well, I need to make this much money for this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, remember why you started doing doing it in the first place. And the purpose is to share and to bring people together. And, in my case, educating people about public lands and waters and conservation issues and things that I really care about. And so it's really about always finding that balance. Mm-hmm. So it was a tricky decision for sure. But it's been really great. I'm glad we've done it.
I love it. Okay, yeah. Last question here, then I'll let you go enjoy your beautiful Los Angeles day.
I'm going to the office after this.
Which is, I'm sure, still also awesome.
Outdoorsy, yes.
So you mentioned, I'm a big comic book nerd. So you mentioned Spider-Man, and you worked on 3 of the movies in the beginning of the interview. Tell me about that, and what does working on mean? Were you director of photography, or what was going on there?
So I was actually I was a publicist. And so I worked in publicity and marketing. Awesome. And so I walked the red carpets with talent. I rode in the back of cars with them on their way to do late night talk shows, and I would prep them and do all that kind of stuff. I worked with magazines quite a bit. I worked with photographers. And I got to essentially build awareness for things, which ended up applying really well in the environmental sector for me, and helping build awareness for causes and things that I was passionate about. But yeah, so that's what brought me there was publicity and marketing. That was the side I was on pretty much the entire time.
That is so cool. You are definitely living the life then. That's the Hollywood dream that the rest of us dream about. Riding in the back of limos with talent and hanging out, or being the talent.
You think it's the dream until you do it.
That's everything, though.
All glamour.
That's everything. It's like until you see how crazy it is. That is awesome, man. Any parting shots? Final thoughts? Before you give me the parting shots,
sure.
What is the I'm going to put you on the hot seat. And I don't know if you can answer this being in Hollywood, but or in Los Angeles, what is who was the best Spider-Man out of all the Spider-Men?
Wow, that's a bold one.
Even the animated one. Who's the best one?
Yeah, the animated one's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Oh man, I don't know. That's pretty tough. I loved the first one. I thought
me too.
The first one, it was so. There was almost a cheesiness that aligned with the original comic books. I was a comic book fan, so working on this was a dream.
Yeah.
It aligned with the comic books. It didn't take itself too seriously, so I have to say I was a fan of the first one the most. And I wouldn't necessarily say that's the best Spider-Man individual. It's like it's the best Spider-Man experience overall.
Yeah, I'd agree with you.
I like the classic.
And I like the first one too because of the score. Danny Elfman did the score on that one, and that's my get ready for something important music on my phone, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Love it. Cool, man. Yeah, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. I appreciate your time today. Parting shots.
Likewise.
Any parting words or places you'd like people to go to check out your work or other things that you have going on?
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, by all means, please, I'd love people to stay in touch on Instagram at Ian Shive Photo. And if you want to learn more about our film, Hidden Pacific, it's simply hiddenpacific.com. And we're getting ready to release the trailer, and the film is opening up all summer long in museums, in giant screen theaters, IMAX theaters worldwide. And so by fall, it should be out there. It's a different market than Spider-Man. It's one of those ones that it sort of rolls out as museums and aquariums and places like that are able to carry the film. But I'm really excited about it because it's a change for me. I'm no longer talking to directors about what they should say about their films. I'm actually talking about my film. So it's been I'm very grateful for the life I've had, and I hope that people will stay in touch and appreciate the work that we're creating as well. And of course, you can see all of our work online as well, our photos and everything through Adobe and Tandem.
Love it. Thank you, Ian, so much. Thanks for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
And congratulations on all your successes and, past, present, and future. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love to see people that are crushing it. You're definitely crushing it. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
All right, Ian, take care, man.
You too. Bye-bye.
This is TWiP.